All right, welcome back, everyone. So here we are with this very important lecture on totalitarianism. Now, this is the topic for the week. You don't have a lot of lecture material, but you'll have a lot of things to think about. And I'm going to give through a lecture, talk about what totalitarianism is, give you a couple of examples, talk about how totalitarianism comes about. We're going to do a quick little kind of interesting experiment in the beginning. And then you also have, of course, to read 1984 and do a pretty big discussion board on that. So while you don't have a lot of lecture material this week, you do have a pretty big, probably I think one of the bigger discussion boards of the semester. So you're going to have to spend some time on that. Not a lot of notes to study, but you're going to be spending time on that. So what do we mean by totalitarianism? What is it? Why is it so important? Well, let's go through all of that, but I want to start with something. And I want to start with an experiment that I want you guys to all try at home. I do this in class, and it's always very interesting. I'm going to go to a picture here, and when I go to the next slide in the picture, I want you just to write down the first word that pops into your mind. And, if you see a picture of a cat, don't write cat, right? I want you, when you see the picture, I want what kind of first feeling or word or idea pops to your mind when you see it. Just don't think, just react, okay? So we're going to do this with two pictures. We're going to do one, and then I'm going to have you write it down, give you a second, and then we'll go to the next one and write it down, and I'll explain why I did all that. All right, so here we go. This is the first one. Again, the first kind of thing that pops to your mind. See this image? Go ahead, write down what you think pops into your mind. Okay, and next image. First thing that pops into your mind. Okay. Well, as you did those two images and you see these three images, why did I do that? Well, look at the words. And when I do this in class, there's an interesting pattern every semester that when people see the symbol associated with Hitler, the Nazi symbol, they of course immediately have this, evil, horrible reaction, as well they should. It's, one of the most evil symbols in human history. When they see the symbol for Stalin and the communism, it's just more like, communist, it's not nearly as horrible in the minds of people. And then, of course, you have this third guy here, Mussolini, right? These are the big three in that we talk about in Western civilization, Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini. You can find examples of totalitarianism all over the world, right? But those are the three best classic examples of it. And if you think about these three men, it was actually Stalin under communism that murdered more than anybody. And, I oftentimes tell students, what's really the difference between Nazism and communism? And the answer is not much. It's ironic because one claims to be far left, one claims to be far right. But reality is, totalitarianism doesn't matter. If these are all authoritarian governments that destroy lives and control lives in a very high degree. And so this is something we're going to kind of talk about in terms of how totalitarianism develops, what are the characteristics of it. And it's really important. I mean, if you think of all the totalitarian rulers globally, you don't see Mao on this image. You don't see people like Pol Pot or Castro or, other individuals, Kim Il-sung and so forth. You take all the totalitarian rulers of the 20th century and you're talking about over 100 million people dead. And, there isn't much more important things to study in history than understanding how did, over 100 million people die because of these political ideologies. So I hope you do really understand a lot of what we're going to be covering here. Again, not a lot of details and names and places and battles so much for this lecture, but a lot of things to think about. All right, so let's get started. So one of the questions is, how did totalitarianism rise, right? We know that it's a big part of the 20th century. How does it happen? And very often the answer is, well, things are bad. And the economy is bad and things are bad and people gravitate to these totalitarian rulers when things are bad. Well, that's a very simplistic answer. And people say, well, look, after World War I and the Great Depression, we see the rise of Hitler and the rise of Stalin and all of that. Yes, but there's other things involved and a few things to think about here. Questions. Do people who are more educated or less educated fall to these hate groups. And a lot of times people say, well, it's less educated people. Well, not always. Very often it's very highly educated people who fall to these groups. Think of the Nazi doctors, right? The Nazi doctors were very well educated people. They did some of the most horrific things. Another thing people say is, well, people gravitate to crime and do bad things when the economy is bad. Again, not true. People do bad things because they don't have the moral compass to know what's right. See, there's this thing, and we'll talk about this more when we get to World War II, is that we are not born naturally good. It's a muscle that needs to be worked. And I found this article, I've been saying this for years, and in 2014, I found this article. Let me read it a little bit to you here. In 2001, political scientists, Donald Green and a couple other people, did more data and found that there was no actual relationship between lynchings and economic hardships. Lynchings actually fell during the Great Depression. Another economist found that the Ku Klux Klan members were actually better educated than the typical American. So this idea that, it's simply uneducated people or people with bad, economic situation gravitating to do these things. It's just not true. It helps push people in there, but it's not true. There is something that is very true, I think, and very often a lot of the totalitarian regimes do appeal to younger people. If you look at them, why do they appeal? Why do these more radical views appeal to younger people very often? And I say this because, most of you probably watching this are, college students, younger people. And I think a large degree is, younger people haven't, and it's not a dig on anybody, it's just reality to everybody. There's a saying, no one's ever seen themselves wiser when they were younger, right? When you're younger, you haven't had the whole life experiences yet. And I think you could be very young, you could be very educated, and still not have that real world understanding of things. There are people with PhDs who live in a little isolated bubble and they're 60, 70, 80 years old, but they've lived in this bubble so long that they don't have a real world view of things. And I think that has an impact as well. So it's a complicated question. It's not so simple as, well, it's just bad things happen and people gravitate to it. Just things to think about, right? Not a lot of lecture notes on this part so far, but things to think about a bit. All right, so now let's kind of define it, right? So I've been talking a lot about it, but I haven't really defined it yet. So what is it? The best way to describe totalitarianism is defined by this man named Vladimir Goryon, and he wrote this very long essay essentially outlining the characteristics. And I kind of put the key points there, but I'm going to read to you from it, and then we'll refer to the key points and explain them. So he says, in totalitarianism, he says, and you definitely want to know his name and you want to know all these points. There are no truly representative subleaders, no independent social groups, no traditional rights, no historical contributions and merits which can check the modern absolute totalitarian rulers. So, what is he saying here? No truly representative subleaders. That's one of the things he mentions there. What does he mean by that? That in totalitarian regimes, whether it's Hitler or Stalin, there's no sub-leaders. We have a president, but we also have a Congress, and you have a Senate. And you might have a Reichstag or a Politburo, but they don't have any real power. That's why it says no truly representative sub-leaders. So that's one. Talked about no independent social groups. What does that mean? Well, independent social groups. Do we have independent social groups in the United States? Yes, so it could be of any political persuasion, of the left or of the right. A political independent social group can be the NRA. It could be, groups for abortion or against abortion. It could be for environmental movements. It could be for, anything. It doesn't matter, right? But independent social groups, those don't exist in totalitarian regimes. And it makes sense because those ideas, those independent social groups can challenge, the government. That's what they don't want. So it sounds a lot like absolutism, right? It's like, well, didn't we study this earlier in the semester? Why don't we just call it absolutism? Well, he explains why it's different than absolutism, and this is what he says. It must be emphasized that the totalitarian systems differ from old-fashioned despotism and autocracy in its use of economic and technological pressures and manifestations of so-called public opinion. The totalitarian rulers do not appeal to divine right, but they claim to represent the true will of the mass and the people. All right, so this control of public opinion that I have there, what do I mean by that? Well, in absolutism, the rule said I rule through divine right. These totalitarian rulers rule through the people, they claim, and they do that because they have the technology to get people to think the way they want. They have the radio, the TV, the press, the media, whatever it is, to get people to think the way they want to think. Guys, if you ever live in a society and every single news station has the same point of view, worried. That's not good. No matter what your political views are, if you're more conservative, more of the left, it doesn't matter. If every single news station only had conservative things, or if every single news station only had left-wing things, that's not good. That's not healthy for a society. And that's, one of the characteristics of totalitarianism. That is, there's just this groupthink and there's no other views, and it's all controlled by the government. So that's part of totalitarianism. All right, he goes on. Let me read a little bit more to you. So again, these are the core characteristics. He says, therefore, it may be said that there are various forms of totalitarianism. Nazism and Soviet communism are political, social, secularized religions characteristic of our epoch. He wrote this in the 1950s, by the way. He says the totalitarian movements and their power replace God and religious institutions such as the church. The leaders are deified. The public mass meetings are regarded and celebrated as sacred actions, right? And so one of the other characteristics there is there's no church, no religious institutions, and the leader is deified. Why? Well, it makes sense. You don't want anybody challenging their authority. And so this is what totalitarianism is. So it's not just, big control, right? It's not somebody I don't like, right? It is specifically these things that do this. And another one of my little pet peeves is how many times people will use the words Nazis or communists and so forth to describe people who aren't. You don't use the word Nazi, you don't use the word Hitler to describe somebody you don't like politically. And, in many ways, what it does is it devalues and diminishes the true evils that those Nazis and communists did. When we talk about World War II especially, and, we'll talk about Stalin here in a second as well, if you compare everyone to Hitler and, what did Hitler do? He rounded up millions of people and put them in gas chambers. And you say, well, this political figure I don't like is Hitler. Then people look, well, that person didn't put people in gas chambers. That means Hitler didn't really put people in gas chambers. I don't know if you're understanding the logic there. But you reserve those words for people who are doing the greatest evil. Otherwise, the word loses meaning. And that's very dangerous. Language matters. So just something else to think about again. A lot of stuff I'm throwing at you in this lecture just to think about here. All right, so let's move on. And we'll start with Stalin. This is not a picture of Stalin. I'll explain what this picture is in a second. And I'll show you another picture of Stalin. I already showed you one earlier. But we'll start with Stalin. And Stalin, again, those are his years, 1879 to 1953. A little bit about his background, first of all, is he actually studied to be a priest. A lot of people don't know this, but Stalin was studying to be a priest. And he got kicked out of the church for not having enough religious values. That's an understatement. Excuse me. And then eventually he rises up through the Bolshevik Revolution and becomes one of the key figures in the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, when Lenin, remember, started the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin had a lot of people close to him. Stalin, but another guy named Trotsky. And what you're seeing in this image is actually Lenin and Trotsky together here. So when Stalin was trying to vie for power, his rival was Trotsky. So it's Stalin and Trotsky are these two rivals. Who's going to replace Lenin? Stalin wins. What does he do with Trotsky? This is an important story. And so this guy Trotsky, what he does with him, first of all, is he exiles him from the Communist Party. He says, you're no longer part of the Communist Party, Trotsky. And remember, they're both communists, right? That wasn't good enough. So then what did he do? He exiled him out of the country and sends him to Mexico. Well, that wasn't good enough either. Then after he sends him to Mexico, and again, you're getting all this down as always, again, not just the words, but everything I say. He gets him out to Mexico. Then he has him assassinated. Stalin had his rival assassinated, right? Now try to imagine, our political system where, we have an election and somebody doesn't like how the election turned out, and you go and you assassinate the other guy, right? That's pretty bad. And he does that. And after that, that's still not good enough. And like, what's left? The guy's dead. Stalin was still not satisfied. What else is Stalin going to do to make sure Trotsky is never a threat to him again? The guy's dead, remember. Watch this. Look at this picture. I'll bring two pictures here. Same image. All right, watch this. This is Lenin and Trotsky. This is Lenin and, oops, where's Trotsky? Bye-bye. What does Stalin do? He erases Trotsky from history, wipes him out. As you're reading 1984, I'm hoping you're pretty much done with that book because you got that big discussion you need to do on it. This should sound a little bit familiar. So this is something that Stalin was known for doing, is just erasing people from history, right? And that's part of totalitarianism as well, erasing history. Whenever you have a society that wants to erase history, again, worry. That's not a good thing. You never erase the history, you teach it. All right, so you have that. Bye-bye, Trotsky. All right, so then once Stalin is in power and he has no rivals, he's going to be in power till 1950s, but his first 5 years, he institutes what is called the 5-year plan. Here's Stalin again. And in this 5-year plan, Stalin, fixes a lot of the problems in Russia. Remember, under the Tsar, they were struggling. Stalin increases metal production, industry grows dramatically, food production grows dramatically, but how is he doing this? Well, he's doing this in a very brutal manner. One of the things he would do is something called agricultural collectivization. What does that mean? Well, basically go to Ma and Pa who had their farm and say, this farm is no longer yours, it now belongs to the government. And if you refuse, you would be shot or sent to the gulags. What are gulags? Definitely a term you want to know if you don't know it. These are Stalin's concentration camps, and again, I'm very careful with language. You don't use the word concentration camps unless horrible things happen, and horrible things happen. People were not just sent to these camps to work, they were sent to work and to die. And millions on top of millions of people were executed in these gulags that Stalin created. In fact, what you're seeing here is an image of him signing a list of death warrants, just a list of names, and you're going to sign this. And this is how Stalin ruled, with an absolute iron fist throughout his years. I think the reason Stalin gets a little bit more of a pass in history than Hitler was because of World War II. And of course, many people know this. During World War II, the United States, the British allied with Stalin. You go, how? Why did we align with Stalin? He's such a horrible person. Well, because we were fighting Hitler. Churchill at the time, again, we'll have a big series of lectures on World War II. They're coming up. They're going to be pretty important, of course. Churchill once said, if Hitler invaded hell, I've had a few nice things to say about the devil. That sometimes in history, these are the pacts you make. It doesn't mean you don't acknowledge that Stalin was an evil monster at the same time. So anyways, this is Stalin's reign. It's very brutal. He also has complete monopoly over media and outlets. And there's a very famous speech, and I put this as an assignment that you should have done by now. I just think because I made an extra credit assignment, which is the speech by Khrushchev, Secret Speech. And I had asked you to read it if you wanted to, and what is it doing, and who is Khrushchev, and all of that. Well, Khrushchev was another Soviet dictator. He follows Stalin. If you think of the 1950s, 60s, especially, Khrushchev is very key. And he had this big secret speech, and he basically said Stalin is this monster. And why is that speech so important? Well, one, it's written by Khrushchev, which is a fellow communist. It's not written by JFK or Ronald Reagan, who hated communism, either of them. And so it's from one of his own. And two, it's a secret speech. In other words, it wasn't made public at the time. And so what he's saying is true. It's like, when a politician says something and the microphone is off, but they don't know it's off, and he guess that's what they really think. Same idea. And so this was a very powerful speech, and it really woke up a lot of people to how horrible Stalin was. And Khrushchev was no nice guy, right? Khrushchev was a pretty brutal guy himself. So when you got somebody like him describing Stalin as horrible, that's pretty telling. All right. So, anyways, that's Stalin. We'll talk more about Stalin, of course, as we get into World War II and then Cold War. So, a little bit about him. All right, we move on. Mussolini. I don't usually cover Mussolini because your textbook does, so I just give people a heads up. Read up your textbook on Mussolini. You definitely want to know him about stuff he does that help bring about World War II. There's some interesting information about him, so just kind of know things about Mussolini. Usually for quizzes, I don't ask quizzes directly from the textbook, but for Mussolini, I'll just give you a heads up. You will probably get a couple pretty easy questions on it from your textbook on the quiz, or it might pop up again. The questions, I create a lot of questions, so if you've probably noticed, not everybody gets the same quiz questions, and so I just put a whole bunch in a test bank and it randomly picks them, so you don't know which ones, but it all covers again all the material. And again, just since we're on the topic of the quizzes, again, remember everything from the Bolshevik Revolution, the interwar years, this lecture, everything we do on World War II, just kind of follow all the directions that I've been posting for you in the modules, and they'll kind of tell you what everything's going to be on. So just make sure you know that and read up on Mussolini. And then we get to Hitler. So what's the deal with Hitler? Well, let's start with this. He was born 1889 from Austria. Guy wasn't even from Germany. He was actually trying to be an artist and failed at that. So Stalin was trying to be a priest and Hitler was trying to be an artist. He actually, a lot of people don't know this, he almost died twice, bastard. World War One, once in the trenches from a gas attack, and once at the end of the war, there was I believe it was a British sniper, and he had this guy Hitler in his eyes, and he could have shot him, but he was like, "Yeah, end of the war. I'm not going to just shoot some soldier," and he lived. And you just kind of imagine if Hitler was killed at that point, how different history would be, and how many millions of lives would have been saved. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. But anyways, I know he does survive, and William II falls in Germany. Remember, Kaiser William II. And then we had the rise of the Weimar Republic. So I think I mentioned that in the last lecture. You had the Weimar Republic. And when the Weimar Republic was in office, Hitler was already involved in this Nazi party. And this Nazi party was very small in the 1920s. It stands for the National Socialist Workers' Party. And in 1920s, they were very small. There were maybe 30, 40,000 of them inside of Germany. And it does stand for National Socialist Workers' Party. And it's very interesting because I found this quote. This goes to what I was kind of saying before. It doesn't really, communism and Nazism. So listen to these words. And if I ask you who said this, most people, well, it sounds more like some radical leftist ideology, right? But this was from a high-level Nazi at the time. It wasn't to Hitler. Sometimes I've seen this quote attributed to Hitler, but it wasn't Hitler. It was a different Nazi. But he said the following: "We are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly valuation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of person responsibility and performance. We are determined to destroy this system under all conditions." So people sometimes use this quote and say, well, is Nazism socialism? Because I thought they went after the socialists. And the answer is both. In the beginning, Nazism embraced a lot of this. I mean, Socialist Workers' Party. I mean, it can't be more in your face. But it's also true that Hitler went after the socialists and the communists later on when he comes into power. Again, this is all any totalitarian regime, anybody who opposes you, it doesn't matter. No one is going to be pure enough for you. If you don't walk the exact party line at that moment, they're coming after you. Think again, remember when we lectured on Robespierre earlier in the semester? This is the Stalin thing. This is the Hitler thing as well. So, Hitler is part of a coup, actually. This Nazi party in 1923 tries a coup to get rid of the Weimar Republic. They try and they fail. And of course, if you try to overthrow your government, you're going to probably get in trouble. Military coups don't go over too well, and usually you probably kill for that. But instead, Hitler and the people who were part of the coup got a 5-year sentence. He didn't even serve that long. He only served, I think, like 8, 9 months, and that's about it. So he got a very lenient sentence, but it was during that time when he was in prison that he wrote this very infamous book called Mein Kampf. And I always ask my students, why is this book important? And most people have heard of the book. It translates to My Struggle, that Hitler wrote while he was in prison there. And, the whole deal with this is people say, well, it's an important book because it outlined his ideas and he told everybody what he wanted to do. And, he, said he was going to kill the Jewish people and wants to kill the Jews and all these things. And all that's true. But really, this is why I tell people the most important thing about this book is this. When he writes this in 1920s, doesn't matter. He's a nobody. He's this pathetic little guy in this Nazi party, that's tiny Nazi group. I wouldn't even call it a party at this point. I don't expect people to have known what he wrote in 1920s, right? 1923, 24. But once he becomes this prominent figure in Germany, and we'll explain how that happens, that book and all of his other writings are vital because this is the thing. Guys, no one can claim ignorance. No one can say, oh, we didn't know, right? He told everybody what he wanted to do. He told everybody what he wanted to kill and murder and everything. So no one can say, well, ignorance, I didn't know what he was going to do. So I think that's an important point about Mein Kampf. Okay, so definitely know all those points there that you have, all those key terms, right? And then the rise of the Nazi powers. So he gets out of prison, and one of the things Hitler was really good at is speeches. And he was a great speaker. He was a great orator. There's a great movie, if you ever get a chance to see it. It's called The King's Speech. If you've never seen it, watch it if you get a chance. It's about the story of the King of England during World War II, who was a stutterer, couldn't speak well, and he had to give speeches on the radio to inspire the people. And he had to get a speech coach. It's all based on a true story. Great movie. And there's a scene in there where he's watching Hitler on TV give a speech, and Hitler's very dynamic in the speech, and it's all in German. And the guy goes, king goes, I have no idea what he's saying, but he's saying it really well. And Hitler had coaches to teach him how to move his hands and how to enunciate certain words. And these speeches gravitated with people. Very often ask people, was Hitler loved or feared? And unfortunately, yes, he was feared by many, but also loved by a lot. And that's kind of the sad part of this is many people, he's talking about literally murdering people, and people are gravitating to him. And this is one of the other things about this situation. Actually, I have another point I'm going to make in a bit. Why do people accept this? And we'll get into that in a bit. But in 1928, 5 years after that coup attempt, there's an election, and the Nazi Party still is small, only gets 2.6% of the vote. So they're tiny, they don't do much. 1929, the Depression hits, unemployment jumps to 26%. 1932, now all of a sudden there are 1 million people in this Nazi party in Germany, right? So this is that where I talked about that connection of yes, economic depression does bring people to hate groups, but there's also this other issue of people just not caring about, the nature of it. And I guess the point I was going to make is that, when Hitler comes to power, he will bring unemployment down. He will bring stability. And it is amazing how many times people in history will follow someone if they bring stability and order and be willing to give up their freedoms. I think that's the big one. That as long as the government is taking care of me, I don't care. And you see that so many times. You go back and study ancient Roman history in the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. The Roman emperors provided peace for Rome, Pax Romana. They provided bread and circus, food and entertainment. And whenever you have to rely on a government to take care of everything for you, you're not really free, guys. And there's an old saying: I rather die standing up than living on my knees. And a lot of people prefer to live on their knees. And this is what happens. This is part of it that allows the Nazis to rise. Is that people are like, hey, this guy's going to solve all my problems. So what? He's going to kill everybody, right? That's the mentality. So we get to the 1932 election, and let me show you on a graph what happens in the 1932 election. I have this term there, plurality. You want to know that term, so get it down before if you need to ever pause again. And what happens in this 1932 election? So remember, 1928, they got 2.6% of the vote. Remember that. So here it is. This is kind of this chart. And what you see is in 1932, the Nazis gained the plurality, 37% of the vote. So if you're looking at a pie chart here, and there's a couple elections in 1932, but in both cases, they don't get a majority. A majority is 51%. They get a plurality. They get more than any other party. None of the other parties had that much. And so when you have multiple parties running, that very often happens. And so in 1932, guys, the Nazis were elected into power. And now I will say a lot of these elections were, two Nazi thugs next to you, pick one. A lot of these elections didn't have checks to see who's voting and how they're voting. And so these elections were not on the up and up completely. And this is why it's always important in any society. You have to make sure every vote is legit and every vote is done in a peaceful way. This is why, I'm not sure if you noticed, but if you ever go to a polling place, you're not allowed anywhere within 100 feet of a polling place to even have a sign supporting a political candidate. You don't want any intimidation. You don't want anybody telling you who to vote for or feel, whatever, right? That's what kind of happened as well. But there was also a good chunk of people who supported the Nazis. And so with that, Hitler now rises to power because he is the leader of this Nazi party. And by 1932-33, he is now leading Germany. So that's this whole plurality that I was trying to explain. So then Hitler's in power, and as I mentioned, unemployment drops dramatically, just like Stalin, improved the economic situation. So does Hitler. Unemployment goes from 6 million people unemployed to only 500,000, which keeps him in power. Another thing he's going to do is create the SA. The SA are the stormtroops, and yes, Star Wars, that's where you get the term from, the bad guys. And so the SA, they're the mass troops, right? Hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of them, stormtroops, right? The SS, those are the elite. There were only 80,000 of them. These were the truly brutal ones. These were the SS, were the ones most responsible for the events of the Holocaust. They were organized and led by this man named Heinrich Himmler. Definitely want to know his name. So the SS were the really, elite top figures in the German military, and they were responsible for most of the atrocities. And then, of course, another thing about Hitler that I always mention, we'll do again, we're not done with Hitler, just like we're not done with Stalin. We'll talk about World War II, obviously in a lot of detail, but Kristallnacht, if you're not familiar with that, Kristallnacht, November 9th, November 10th, 1938. This is the night of broken glass, and this is when, of course, Hitler went through Germany and sent his troops in, and they broke the homes of the merchants of the Jewish homes, forced the Jewish people to wear the Star of David. There were things even before 1938 that Hitler was doing. I'll talk about when we get to the World War II lecture. That were already signs that things were going to be really bad. And a lot of times people ask, why didn't the Jews go anywhere? And one of the most important points is the Jews had nowhere to go. And some people go, wasn't there a state of Israel for the Jewish people? Yeah, but there was no state of Israel at that time. The state of Israel had not been created yet. Some people who study the Middle East, and I teach a lot of Middle Eastern history, sometimes make this a very erroneous claim. They say, well, the state of Israel came back out because of the Holocaust. No, the Holocaust happened because there was no state of Israel. There was no place for the Jewish people to have a safe haven where they can defend themselves. They were scattered around Europe, where Hitler, of course, just, massacred them once we get to the war. So I think that's a very important point to remember as well. All right, so anyway, so that's a little bit about the rise of totalitarianism. Not exactly the most happy, pleasant of lectures, I know that, but very important. And so, again, there weren't a lot of words and terms in this lecture, but the ones I gave you, you obviously need to know, and you definitely kind of see a lot of the ideas. So I hope I gave you a lot of things to think about in today's lecture. And then you got 1984 to do, and then the big World War II lectures coming up. That's going to be big, big, big. You're going to be listening to all those, taking a lot of good notes on them. All right. Thank you, guys.